Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring the story of a man who lay nameless in the Arizona desert for more than half a century, and the arrest that finally came 54 years after his remains were found. How does a person simply vanish from history, reduced to an entry in a file labeled John Doe, while those responsible go on living their lives? And what happens when modern science reaches back across 5 decades to demand an answer? Here's what happened. It is also, in certain remote stretches, the kind of place where a person can disappear, and the land itself will keep that secret for a very long time. Somewhere in that remote desert terrain, in the spring of 1971, skeletal human remains were discovered. But in 2025, forensic genetic genealogy gave him back his name. He was Charles Defehr, and within a short time of that identification being made public, investigators announced the arrest of a 79-year-old woman named Helen Hanson, identified by the Pima County Sheriff's Department as his stepdaughter. It asks us to think about what we owe to the unidentified dead, how we treat the cold cases that pile up in filing cabinets across the country, and whether there is ever truly a moment when justice becomes impossible. The answer this case offers, at least for now, is that it is not. Before we move deeper into the story, let me set the stage, because the context of this case matters enormously. Context: a John Doe in the Arizona desert. Pima County, Arizona, is not a small jurisdiction. It encompasses the city of Tucson, which in 1971 had a population of around 200,000 people and was growing rapidly. But the county itself is enormous, stretching across thousands of square miles of Sonoran desert terrain, much of it rugged, remote, and sparsely populated. It borders Mexico to the south. It contains wilderness areas, mountain ranges, and vast stretches of desert floor where the nearest paved road can be miles away. This geography matters. The American Southwest, and Pima County in particular, has historically been a region with significant transient populations. Migrant workers, travelers, drifters, individuals moving through the region with no permanent ties to a community. In the 1960s and 1970s, the counterculture movement added another layer, with young people hitchhiking across the country, living off the grid, disconnected from the kinds of systems that might have recorded their presence or their absence. When someone went missing in that world, they were not always missed immediately. And when remains were discovered in a remote desert location, identifying them could be an extraordinarily difficult task even under the best of circumstances. In 1971, the circumstances were far from the best. There was no national DNA database. There was no centralized missing persons clearinghouse, at least not in the form we know today. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, commonly known as NAMIS, would not exist for decades. Digital records did not exist. Investigators working a Jane or John Doe case in the early 1970s were limited to physical photographs, fingerprint comparisons when prints were available, dental record matching when records could be obtained, and the laborious process of comparing the physical description of unidentified remains against paper missing persons reports filed in local jurisdictions across the country. You had to know, roughly, who you were looking for before you could find them. And that, in a case with no immediate leads and no witnesses stepping forward, made identification profoundly difficult. The Pima County John Doe of 1971 was not an isolated case. Across the American Southwest during this era, dozens of individuals were buried or cremated as unknowns, their cases open in the technical sense but inactive in any practical sense. Investigators carried enormous caseloads, resources were limited, and as the years passed, the file on any individual John Doe became less and less likely to receive fresh attention. But Charles Defehr, whoever he was in life, was never truly forgotten by the system that recorded his discovery. His case remained open, and when the tools to solve it finally arrived, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was ready to use them. Now let us go back to the beginning. Beat 1. The Desert Discovery and a Nameless Man. April 1971. The remains were skeletal, which immediately removed many of the physical identifiers that investigators might have otherwise used. Skeletal remains do not carry fingerprints. They do not carry wallet contents or personal effects if those items have degraded or been removed. What they do carry is biological information encoded in bone and tooth, information that forensic science in 1971 could read only in the most basic terms. Investigators could determine, from the skeletal remains, certain physical characteristics of the individual. Approximate age at the time of death, based on bone density and the condition of the joints and teeth. Biological sex, based on skeletal morphology. approximate height, from the long bones of the legs. These parameters could then be used to narrow the field of potential missing persons matches, but only if those matches had been reported and recorded in a form that investigators could access. The investigation at the scene would also have examined the surrounding terrain for any evidence that might explain the circumstances of death. According to public statements from the Pima County Sheriff's Department and media coverage of the 2025 identification and arrest, this case was investigated as a homicide, meaning that authorities had reason to believe, from the beginning or from early in their investigation, that Charles Defehr had not died of natural causes in that desert location. What specific evidence led investigators to classify the case as a homicide is not fully detailed in the public record that forms the basis of this account. What is established, through official public statements by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, is that the case has been consistently treated as a homicide investigation and that the manner of death was not natural. Somewhere in Pima County, Arizona, in the early spring of 1971, a man died a violent or suspicious death. His body was left in a remote desert location. And for 54 years, not only was the person responsible for that death not held accountable, but the victim himself could not be named. He could not be mourned properly. His family, if they were looking for him, did not know what had happened to him or where. And the investigators who had worked the case in 1971, many of whom have since passed away themselves, never got to see it resolved. The case was logged, the skeletal remains were preserved, which is a critical detail we will return to. And the file on the Pima County John Doe of 1971 moved into the cold case archives, where it would remain for decades. Now, you might be asking yourself at this point, what was happening on the other side of this story? Someone had reported Charles Defehr missing. His family, or at least some members of it, knew that he had disappeared. They had gone through the agonizing process of reporting that disappearance, of waiting for answers that never came, of eventually, perhaps, having to accept that those answers might never arrive. The public record does not provide detailed information about when exactly Charles Defehr was reported missing, by whom, or what the circumstances of that report were. What is established, according to Pima County Sheriff's Department public statements and subsequent news coverage by outlets including Cold News 13, KGUN 9, and the Arizona Daily Star, is that he had been reported missing decades earlier. That means his disappearance was known, on record, somewhere in the system. And yet, for over 50 years, the records of a missing man and the remains of an unidentified man did not connect. That gap, that failure of connection, is not the result of negligence. It is the result of systemic limitations that existed across law enforcement in the United States during this era. Missing persons cases were filed locally. Unidentified remains were cataloged locally. There was no universal mechanism for matching one to the other on a national scale. It was, in the bleakest sense, entirely possible for a person to be both missing and found at the same time, with no one in the world knowing it. There is something profound and deeply saddening about that reality. Charles Defehr had people in his life. He had a history, a story, a set of relationships that made him who he was. He had a stepdaughter, as we know from the 2025 investigation. He had a family, or had had one. And for 54 years, none of that context could be attached to the remains that lay in a repository in Pima County. Here is a question I want you to sit with for a moment, and it is one worth leaving in the comments below. When you think about the thousands of John and Jane Doe cases that remain open across the United States, cases just like this one before 2025, do you believe that law enforcement and government agencies are doing enough to prioritize the identification of the unidentified dead? It is a question that goes beyond this one case, and it is a question that the cold case community has been wrestling with for a very long time. Tell us what you think. Now, let us talk about the long silence that followed, and the science that finally broke it. Beat 2. Decades of silence and the rise of forensic genealogy. The years passed. The 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. The file on the Pima County John Doe of 1971 Saturday in the archives. It was not forgotten, exactly, but it was not active in any meaningful investigative sense. There were no new leads. There were no new witnesses. There was no new technology, at least not initially, that could reach into a set of skeletal remains and pull out a name. Cold cases are, in many ways, the saddest artifacts of the justice system. They represent moments where the system did its best and fell short, and then had to keep carrying the weight of that failure year after year. The investigators who had worked the original case retired or passed on. New investigators came in, looked at old files, and sometimes managed to find new traction on cold cases through fresh eyes or new technology. But more often than not, without a genuine investigative breakthrough, a cold case simply aged in place. The Pima County Sheriff's Department maintained a cold case unit, as many sheriff's departments and police departments across the country do. These units do vital work, revisiting old cases with newer forensic techniques, resubmitting evidence to modern labs, looking for connections that older investigators might have missed. It is slow, difficult, often unrewarding work, but occasionally, it yields results that are nothing short of remarkable. For Charles Defehr's case, the breakthrough came not from a single piece of overlooked evidence or a confession or a witness who had been holding information for decades. It came from a technology that did not exist when he died, that barely existed when most of the investigators who worked his original case were still in the field. Forensic genetic genealogy. For most of that history, its primary application was matching a DNA sample from a crime scene to a suspect who was already in the system, meaning someone whose DNA profile had been collected and entered into a database like the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS. If a suspect was not in CODIS, if they had never been arrested or convicted of an offense that required a DNA sample, their profile was not in the database, and the DNA evidence simply produced no match. For cases involving unidentified remains, this limitation was even more pronounced. You could establish a DNA profile from the remains, but unless you had a relative whose profile was already in a law enforcement database, that profile existed in isolation. It could tell you what the DNA profile looked like. It could not tell you whose profile it was. What forensic genetic genealogy did was open an entirely new avenue. Starting around 2018, with the high-profile identification of the Golden State Killer suspect in California, investigators began using a technique that combined traditional DNA profiling with publicly accessible genealogy databases, most notably GEDmatch and later other platforms. The process works like this. A DNA sample is extracted from unidentified remains and a full genomic profile is developed. That profile is then uploaded to a genealogy database where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their own DNA data for the purpose of discovering their ancestry and finding relatives. The forensic DNA profile is compared against those millions of profiles to identify partial matches, the kind of partial matches you would expect to see between relatives who share a significant portion of their genetic material. From those partial matches, forensic genealogists, working in collaboration with law enforcement, begin to build family trees. If the unidentified remains share 25% of their DNA with someone in the database, that could indicate a first cousin, an aunt or uncle, or a grandparent-grandchild relationship. Working backward and forward through genealogical records, public documents, historical records, and census data, forensic genealogists can often narrow the potential identity of unidentified remains to a small number of individuals, or even to a single person. It is painstaking work. It requires expertise in both DNA science and genealogical research. It requires access to public records, historical documents, and databases. But when it works, it is extraordinary. And it has worked in case after case after case since 2018. According to coverage by Cold News 13, KGUN 9, the Arizona Daily Star, and public statements by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, investigators submitted DNA from the 1971 remains for forensic genetic genealogy analysis. This is, in the context of what we know about cold case investigation practices in recent years, entirely consistent with the broader national trend of law enforcement agencies submitting DNA from long unidentified remains to forensic genealogy specialists in hopes of finally giving those remains a name. The fact that DNA could be successfully extracted and profiled from remains that had been in the desert since 1971 and in a repository for decades afterward is itself worth pausing on. The preservation of skeletal remains in the dry Sonoran desert can actually be favorable compared to wetter climates, where biological material degrades more rapidly. The desert heat can be damaging in other ways, but for long-term preservation of bone, arid conditions can sometimes work in investigators' favor. Add to that the careful preservation of the remains by the Pima County Sheriff's Department over the decades, and you have the conditions necessary for a successful genetic analysis more than 50 years after the fact. He had a family that, somewhere, had been without answers for more than 5 decades. And for the investigators at the Pima County Sheriff's Department who had carried this case, or who had taken it on as part of the cold case unit's work, this was the moment that everything changed. But identification was only the beginning. Because once you know who a victim is, the nature of the investigation transforms entirely. A John Doe case is, in many ways, an investigation running in the dark. You are trying to establish identity, origin, and circumstances of death simultaneously, without the crucial framework of knowing who the person was and what their life looked like. Once you have an identity, you have context. You can look at who was in that person's life. You can look at who might have had reason to harm them. You can look at what circumstances surrounded their disappearance. You can look at records, interviews, family histories, and the kind of documentary trail that a person's life inevitably leaves behind. For Charles Defehr, that trail led investigators to someone very close to him. Someone who had been living, apparently, without facing any legal consequences for more than 50 years. Someone who was now 79 years old. But before we get to that arrest, I want to take a moment to talk about what the rise of forensic genetic genealogy means for the broader landscape of unresolved cases, because it speaks directly to why this case matters beyond the story of Charles Defehr himself. As of the time of this video's production, there are thousands of unidentified remains in the United States, many of them listed in the NamUs database, many of them not. Each one of those cases represents a person who had a life, a family, a story. Each one of those cases also potentially represents a crime that went unanswered, a perpetrator who faced no consequences. Forensic genetic genealogy, with appropriate legal and ethical frameworks in place, has the potential to resolve a significant number of those cases. It has already done so in hundreds of instances across the country since its introduction as an investigative tool. The case of Charles Defehr is, in that sense, not just the story of one man and one 54-year-old mystery. It is also a demonstration of what becomes possible when investigative agencies commit to using new tools on old problems, when they refuse to let a case go cold simply because the original investigation ran out of road. Now, here is another question I want to put to you, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Forensic genetic genealogy works by matching DNA profiles against databases where individuals have voluntarily submitted their own genetic information, typically for ancestry research. Those individuals almost certainly did not anticipate that their DNA data might be used by law enforcement to identify distant relatives in criminal cases. Does that concern you? Do you think the use of these databases for law enforcement purposes is an appropriate trade-off, given the justice it can provide in cases like this one? Or does it raise privacy concerns that give you pause? There is no simple answer to that question, and reasonable people disagree. Leave your thoughts below. The year was 2025. 54 years after his remains were discovered in the Arizona desert, Charles Defehr was named. And the investigation that followed moved quickly toward an arrest. Beat 3. From identification to arrest. Because this had always been classified as a homicide. The manner in which this case was treated from the beginning, as a criminal investigation rather than a simple effort to identify unknown remains, meant that the identification of Charles Defehr was not the end of anything. It was, in many ways, the most important beginning. Think about the investigative work that suddenly became possible once the identity was known. Investigators could now research Charles Defehr's life, his relationships, his circumstances at the time of his disappearance. They could look at who was in his immediate family and social circle in the period leading up to his death. They could consult historical records, which in this context means documents going back to the early 1970s and potentially earlier. They could potentially interview people who had known Defehr, though 54 years is a long time and many of those individuals would either no longer be living or would have memories significantly dimmed by the passage of time. They could also, critically, look at the missing persons report that had been filed decades earlier. If a report was in the system, it contained information. It contained a name, or names, of people who had reported him missing, people who had known him, people who had last seen him. That report, combined with the genealogical information that had led investigators to his identity in the first place, would have provided a framework for understanding the people who were closest to Defehr at the time of his disappearance. According to public statements by the Pima County Sheriff's Department and news coverage by outlets including Cold News 13 and KGUN 9, investigators conducting this renewed homicide investigation identified Charles Defehr's stepdaughter as a person of focus in the case. That stepdaughter is Helen Hanson. Under the United States legal system, and under the fundamental principles of justice that this channel takes seriously, she is presumed innocent unless and until a court of law finds otherwise. Everything this channel presents about her connection to this case is drawn from public statements by the Pima County Sheriff's Department and public news reporting, and it reflects what law enforcement has asserted, not what has been proven. That said, what law enforcement has asserted, and what public records establish, is this. After the identification of Charles Defehr through forensic genetic genealogy, investigators re-examined historical records and conducted renewed investigative work. That work led them to Helen Hanson. In 2025, she was arrested in connection with Defehr's death. According to public reporting from Cold News 13, KGUN 9, and the Arizona Daily Star, the arrest was made following that renewed investigation, and the case is now pending prosecution. In a case where the witnesses are asking their memories to reach back more than 5 decades, the challenges are compounded enormously. This is not to say that prosecution is impossible. It is to say that the evidentiary picture in a case like this one is necessarily different from what you would expect in a contemporary homicide investigation. Prosecutors and investigators working this case would need to work with the evidence that time has left intact, to build a picture of what happened from the materials that survived 54 years. What forms might that evidence take? The forensic evidence from the remains themselves, which has been preserved. The genetic genealogy work that identified Defehr and connected him to his family. Historical records, including documents from the 1970s that may establish the relationship between Defehr and the individuals in his life, his whereabouts at relevant times, any relevant communications or financial records that have been preserved. Potentially, statements from individuals who were living in 1971 and are still available to investigators today. The fact that an arrest was made suggests that investigators and prosecutors assessed the available evidence and determined that there was sufficient legal basis to bring charges. In the United States legal system, an arrest typically requires probable cause, and a formal charge typically requires a determination by a prosecutor that the evidence supports moving forward. Neither of those is a guarantee of conviction, but both represent assessments by legal professionals that the case has merit. The arrest did not come until she was almost 80 years old, more than half a century after the events in question. What does that kind of waiting mean, from every direction? For the family members of Charles Defehr who had been seeking answers, the identification and arrest may represent a form of closure that they had long since given up hoping for. For investigators who had worked the case over the years, or who inherited it as part of the cold case unit, the resolution represents the fulfillment of a professional and moral commitment to see a homicide case through regardless of how long it takes. For the justice system itself, this case represents both a testament to what modern forensic science can achieve and a challenge to the traditional mechanisms of prosecution, which were not designed with 50-year gaps between crime and trial in mind. And for Charles Defehr himself, if we extend the courtesy of considering what the resolution of this case means in the most human terms, it means that he is no longer a John Doe. He is no longer a nameless set of remains in a repository. He is a person, identified, remembered, and now the subject of an active effort to bring justice to bear on what happened to him in April 1971. That matters. Regardless of how the prosecution of Helen Hanson ultimately resolves, the identification of Charles Defehr is itself a meaningful act. It restores dignity to a man who spent 54 years without his own name. And it serves as a reminder that the unidentified dead deserve the same commitment to justice that we extend to those whose identities we know from the beginning. Here's a question I want to pose to you now, one that I think gets to the heart of something this case forces us to confront. Given the enormous challenges of prosecuting a case more than 50 years after the fact, given the degradation of evidence and the fading of memories, do you believe that justice is truly achievable in cases like this one? Or do you think that the passage of time fundamentally changes what justice can look like? There is an argument that any acknowledgement of the truth, any formal legal recognition of what was done to a person, constitutes a form of justice even if it falls short of what a contemporary prosecution might achieve. And there is an argument that without a conviction, the concept of justice remains unfulfilled. I want to know where you stand. Leave your answer in the comments. Now, let us bring all of this together and look at what we know, what we do not know, and what the future of this case may hold. Resolution and reflection. In April 1971, skeletal remains were discovered in a remote desert area of Pima County, Arizona. The Pima County Sheriff's Department investigated, classified the case as a homicide, and preserved the remains. But the technology needed to identify the victim did not yet exist, and the case went cold. For 54 years, the man lay in a repository under the designation of John Doe. In 2025, investigators used forensic genetic genealogy to identify the remains as those of Charles Defehr, a man who had been reported missing decades earlier. The identification was made possible by the extraction of DNA from the preserved skeletal remains and the comparison of that genetic profile against publicly accessible genealogy databases, from which genealogical researchers working with law enforcement were able to build a family tree and arrive at Defehr's identity. Following that identification, investigators reopened the homicide investigation with the full context that a known identity provides. They re-examined historical records. They conducted new investigative work. And they identified Defehr's stepdaughter, Helen Hanson, then 79 years old, as the focus of that renewed investigation. Helen Hanson was arrested in 2025 in connection with Charles Defehr's death. The case is currently pending prosecution. Helen Hanson has not been convicted of any offense and is presumed innocent under the law. The case has been covered by local Arizona media outlets including Cold News 13, KGUN 9, and the Arizona Daily Star, and the identification and arrest were announced publicly by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The details presented in this video are drawn from those public sources. And it demonstrates, with striking clarity, the transformative potential of that technology when applied to cases that have resisted resolution for decades. Consider the chain of events that made this resolution possible. Investigators in 1971 did their jobs, classified the case correctly as a homicide, preserved the remains rather than disposing of them as unidentifiable, and maintained the case file for decades. The cold case unit at the Pima County Sheriff's Department kept the file active and committed to revisiting it when new tools became available. Scientists and genealogists developed the technology and methodology of forensic genetic genealogy in the years after 2018. Millions of ordinary people voluntarily submitted their DNA to ancestry databases for personal reasons, creating the vast reference pools against which forensic genealogists can work. And investigators at the Pima County Sheriff's Department made the decision to submit Defehr's DNA for genealogical analysis, acting on the conviction that even a 50-year-old case deserved a fresh attempt at resolution. Every one of those steps was necessary. Remove any one of them and the case does not resolve. That is a remarkable thing to sit with. The identification of Charles Defehr is not the result of a single decision or a single technological breakthrough. It is the cumulative product of 54 years of institutional commitment and scientific progress, coming together at exactly the right moment. The precise evidence that led investigators to focus on Helen Hanson has not been fully disclosed in the public reporting available at the time of this video's production. The full history of the relationship between Charles Defehr and his stepdaughter has not been entered into the public record in a form that this video can responsibly rely upon. These are details that will emerge, if they emerge, through the course of the legal proceedings that lie ahead. What we do know is enough to tell a powerful and important story. A man was killed and left in the desert. His identity was taken from him by time and by the limitations of the era's forensic science. 54 years later, modern technology gave him back his name. And within a short time of that name being restored to him, an arrest was made. That is not a perfect story. It does not have a tidy ending. The legal process is ongoing, and its outcome cannot be predicted or presumed. But it is a story about perseverance, about the refusal of a justice system to abandon a case simply because it has aged. And it is, in the most fundamental sense, a story about a man who deserved to be remembered. Charles Defehr was a person. He had a life. He had people in his life who knew him, loved him, perhaps depended on him or resented him or some complicated combination of both, as is true of all human relationships. He disappeared in 1971, and for 54 years the world did not know where he had gone or what had happened to him. Now the world knows his name. Now there is a legal process underway that will determine what, if anything, can be done to account for what happened to him. That is not nothing. In fact, in the world of cold cases and unresolved mysteries, it is everything. The John and Jane Doe cases that remain unresolved, thousands of them in the NamUs database alone, represent thousands of Charles Defehrs. Thousands of people who were once known, once loved, once missed, and who now exist only as case numbers and skeletal remains. The resolution of cases like this one, through the application of forensic genetic genealogy, offers those families something that they have not always had reason to feel. Hope. The technology exists. The methodology is established. The costs of genetic analysis have dropped significantly over the years and continue to fall. There is a growing national movement, supported by advocacy organizations, legislators, and law enforcement agencies, to systematically apply forensic genealogy to the backlog of unidentified remains across the country. Progress is being made, case by case, family by family. Charles Defehr's case is one of those cases. And his identification is a reminder that it is never too late, and that the unidentified dead are waiting for exactly the kind of effort that the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the forensic genealogists who worked this case brought to bear. If you want to learn more about John and Jane Doe cases in the United States, the NamUs database is a public resource where you can search unidentified remains cases across the country. Organizations like the Doe Network and DNA Doe Project are also engaged in this work and welcome public support and awareness. If you believe this work matters, consider learning more about what those organizations do. Helen Hanson is a real person who is, under the law, presumed innocent of the charges that have been brought against her. The families of everyone involved are real people who carry the weight of these events in ways that no video or podcast can fully represent. This channel approaches every case with that responsibility in mind. We tell these stories because they matter, because the victims deserve to be remembered, because the pursuit of justice deserves to be documented, and because the public has an interest in understanding how the justice system works and where it falls short. We do not tell these stories for sensationalism. We do not speculate beyond what the public record supports. And we always hold the presumption of innocence as an inviolable standard. The story of Charles Defehr and the arrest of Helen Hanson in 2025 is still being written. The legal proceedings lie ahead. The full accounting of what happened in the Arizona desert in April 1971 has not yet been made in a court of law. We will continue to follow this case as public information becomes available, and we will bring you updates as the story develops. In the meantime, Charles Defehr has his name back. After 54 years, that is something worth acknowledging. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on notifications so you do not miss new cases when they go up. We cover cold cases, unresolved mysteries, and the science and investigative work behind some of the most remarkable case resolutions in recent years, all with the care and seriousness that these stories deserve. Share this video if you think someone else should know about Charles Defehr and the 54-year journey to give him back his name. The more people who know about cases like this, the more pressure there is on investigators and funding bodies to apply modern forensic tools to the thousands of unresolved cases still waiting for resolution. Thank you for watching True Crime Mysteries. We will see you in the next one.